The marriage certificate remains preserved at the Louisiana State Archives, now yellowed and brittle with age, displaying the names of Jeremiah Aldrich and Celeste, who was listed merely as property positioned beneath his signature. What renders this document so deeply unsettling isn't solely the inherently grotesque nature of a plantation owner wedding his enslaved cook, but rather the 13 mysterious deaths that occurred during the months immediately following their March 1854 ceremony. Newspapers from that era, carefully maintained within private collections, suggest a conspiracy of such elaborate cruelty that authorities chose to bury the investigation entirely, thereby protecting several of Louisiana's most influential families. The truth lurking behind this forced marriage exposes an intricate web woven from betrayal, calculated revenge, and systematic torture that managed to shock even the violence-hardened sensibilities of the antebellum South. Before we proceed further into the story of Jeremiah Aldrich and the hellish fate awaiting him at Willowbrook Plantation, please subscribe to our channel and comment below letting us know which state you're listening from. Now, allow me to transport you back to an era when honor carried supreme importance and when broken trust could destroy a man in ways far exceeding mere death. The chain of events culminating in that unholy marriage began 15 years earlier amid the murky backwaters of the Mississippi Delta, where fortunes were constructed from human flesh and blood. Money flowed as freely as the muddy river waters themselves. Jeremiah Aldrich hadn't been born into the plantation aristocracy that defined Louisiana society throughout the 1840s. As the son of a failed Kentucky tobacco farmer, he arrived in New Orleans during 1839 possessing nothing except burning ambition and willingness to engage in business activities that more established gentlemen wouldn't touch even with their finest gloves. The slave trade, though technically legal, carried considerable social stigma among the old Creole families, who preferred maintaining the convenient fiction that their wealth derived exclusively from sugar and cotton rather than from systematically buying and selling human beings. During the sweltering summer of 1840, Aldrich formed his partnership with Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle, two men whose desperation matched his own ruthless ambition perfectly. Devo, the youngest son of a declining sugar baron, required money to rescue his family's crumbling plantation from advancing creditors. Rochelle, a former ship captain who had lost everything to yellow fever and unfortunate investments, possessed invaluable knowledge regarding illegal slave routes operating from Cuba and various Caribbean islands. Together they established what they called the Delta Trading Company. Operating from a warehouse positioned on New Orleans' outskirts, where the law's reach grew thin and questions weren't asked about merchandise origins, the business proved more profitable than any of them had dared imagine. While legitimate slave traders dealt in documented property accompanied by clear titles and health certificates, Aldrich's operations specialized in what they euphemistically termed recovery services. They purchased enslaved individuals who had escaped from failed plantations, acquired kidnapped free blacks from corrupt bounty hunters, and most lucratively smuggled fresh captives from illegal ships still crossing the Atlantic despite the official international slave trade ban. The profit margins proved extraordinary because their operating costs remained minimal. They cared nothing for the health, housing, or basic humanity of their merchandise. For 3 years the partnership flourished within New Orleans society's shadows. They reinvested their profits into legitimate businesses, purchasing respectability alongside property. Devo saved his family's plantation and expanded it into one of St. Charles Parish's most productive sugar operations. Rochelle purchased a riverboat fleet and became a respected shipping magnate. Aldrich himself acquired Willowbrook Plantation, a modest yet profitable cotton operation located roughly 40 miles upriver from New Orleans, complete with a grand colonial mansion announcing his arrival among Louisiana's planter elite. However, success bred carelessness, and carelessness attracted attention from people who mattered. During the spring of 1843, word reached them that federal marshals were investigating illegal slave trading operations along the Gulf Coast. Someone had been asking questions about their business, examining shipping records, and worst of all, interviewing some of their former merchandise who had managed escape or obtained freedom through other means. The three partners convened an emergency session in Aldrich's new Willowbrook study, surrounded by leather-bound books he couldn't read and oil paintings depicting ancestors who weren't his own. The tension within that room grew suffocating as each man realized their empire of human misery was about to collapse. Devo, always the most nervous among them, suggested immediate partnership dissolution and destruction of all transaction records. Rochelle, possessing his sailor's pragmatism, argued for a more measured approach involving shifting assets offshore while waiting for the investigation to pass. But Aldrich conceived a different solution, one revealing the true depths of his moral bankruptcy. He had already decided to eliminate his partners and steal their combined assets. However, he required a plan that would remove suspicion from himself while silencing the two men whose knowledge could destroy him. The solution arrived with the cold clarity characteristic of pure evil. He would murder both men and arrange the scene suggesting they had killed each other during a money dispute. With Devo and Rochelle dead, he would emerge as the sole survivor of a tragic business disagreement, free to disappear evidence of their illegal activities while retaining all their accumulated wealth. The murder occurred on a humid June evening in 1843 at the warehouse serving as their operational base for 3 years. Aldrich arranged the meeting under pretense of planning their slave trading business exit strategy. He selected the location carefully. The warehouse district stood largely abandoned after sunset, and the building itself faced demolition the following month as the city expanded its commercial port facilities. Aldrich arrived early, concealing a loaded pistol within his coat and a razor-sharp skinning knife inside his boot. His plan was brutally straightforward: shoot Devo first, then stage a knife fight with Rochelle, ending with both men dead while he claimed self-defense. He had even prepared false witnesses, 3 men hired from the docks who would swear they'd observed Devo and Rochelle arguing violently earlier that day about missing account money. When his partners arrived, they found Aldrich already seated at their usual planning table, an expensive whiskey bottle and 3 glasses arranged between ledger stacks and shipping documents. The conversation began normally with Devo reviewing the legal threats confronting them and Rochelle outlining an asset transfer plan to Havana banks where American law couldn't reach. But as evening progressed and whiskey flowed, Aldrich steered discussion toward their accumulated wealth, specifically the cash reserve locations hidden throughout various New Orleans banks and safe houses. Rochelle first sensed something wrong. The old sailor's instincts, honed through years of dangerous voyages and violent ports, detected subtle changes in Aldrich's demeanor, the way his eyes never quite met theirs, how his hand kept drifting toward his coat pocket, the tension in his voice when asking about individual account numbers and security arrangements. When Rochelle suggested postponing the meeting and reconvening the following day with their lawyers present, Aldrich recognized his opportunity window was closing. Violence erupted with shocking suddenness. Aldrich drew his pistol and fired directly into Devo's chest before the younger men could react. The shot echoed through the empty warehouse like thunder, and Devo collapsed backward in his chair, blood spreading across his white shirt as his eyes widened with shock and betrayal. But Rochelle, despite being caught off guard, proved more resilient than Aldrich had anticipated. The former sea captain overturned the heavy table between them and lunged forward with a broken whiskey bottle, slashing at Aldrich's face and opening a deep gash across his left cheek that would leave a permanent scar. What followed was a desperate struggle lasting nearly 10 minutes, far longer than Aldrich had planned. Rochelle fought with the fury of a man understanding exactly what was happening and refusing to die quietly. They crashed through document crates, scattered ledgers across the floor, and left blood trails on every surface as they grappled for control of the knife Aldrich had drawn from his boot. In the end, Rochelle's age betrayed him. At 53, he simply couldn't match the younger man's strength and endurance. Aldrich finally managed to drive the blade deep into Rochelle's stomach, twisting it upward toward his heart, while the old sailor clawed desperately at his throat. But even as Rochelle died, he managed to gasp out words that would haunt Aldrich for the rest of his life. "My son knows everything. He'll come for you. When he's old enough, he'll make you pay." At the time, Aldrich dismissed these as a dying man's delusional ravings. He had no idea that Marcus Devo's younger brother, Philippe, had been secretly documenting their illegal activities, or that Samuel Rochelle's 17-year-old son, Henri, possessed detailed knowledge of every transaction, every contact, and every crime the Delta Trading Company had committed throughout 3 years of operation. Aldrich spent the next 4 hours methodically arranging the crime scene to support his planned story. He positioned Devo's body suggesting the men had been shot while reaching for a weapon, then placed Rochelle nearby with a bloody knife in hand and defensive wounds implying a struggle between the two victims. He scattered money around the room suggesting a financial dispute, damaged the office safe implying a robbery gone wrong, and even inflicted additional wounds on his own hands and arms supporting his claim of being an innocent bystander caught in their violent confrontation. The false witnesses performed exactly as paid, testifying to police that they had seen Devo and Rochelle arguing earlier that evening about missing partnership funds. A corrupt dock worker claimed hearing shouting from the warehouse around the murder time, followed by gunshots and violent struggle sounds. Most crucially, Aldrich had prepared a convincing explanation for his presence at the scene. He claimed arriving to mediate his partner's dispute, only to walk into a deadly confrontation leaving him fighting for his own life. The New Orleans police, overwhelmed by more pressing crimes and eager to close a case involving three relatively respectable businessmen, accepted Aldrich's version with minimal investigation. The official report concluded that Devo and Rochelle had killed each other during a business dispute, with Aldrich barely escaping the same fate. Within a week, the warehouse was demolished as planned, destroying any remaining physical evidence of the partnership's illegal activities. With his partners dead and their assets suddenly available for claiming, Aldrich moved quickly to consolidate his newfound wealth. He presented himself as the surviving partner of a legitimate shipping company, producing carefully forged documents showing Devo and Rochelle had agreed to transfer their shares to him upon their deaths. Banks that had been suspicious of three unknown men conducting large cash transactions readily accepted the word of a single plantation owner possessing documented successful cotton production history. Over the following months, Aldrich systematically emptied every account, safe deposit box, and hidden cash belonging to his murdered partners. He estimated the total value at nearly $40,000, a fortune worth over $1 million in today's currency. More importantly, he had eliminated the only two people capable of connecting him to the Delta Trading Company's illegal operations, leaving him free to reinvent himself as a respectable Louisiana Society member. But Aldrich had made a fatal miscalculation. In his obsessive focus on immediate threats and financial opportunities, he had completely ignored the families of the men he had murdered. Specifically, he had failed to consider that both Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle had younger relatives who would soon learn the truth about their deaths, and who would spend the next decade carefully, methodically, patiently planning revenge so elaborate and devastating that death would seem merciful compared to what they had in store for him. Philippe Devo was 22 years old when his brother Marcus was murdered. Unlike the older Devo, who had always prioritized immediate gratification over long-term planning, Philippe possessed a calculating intelligence, making him far more dangerous than Aldrich ever imagined. As Marcus' closest confidant and unofficial business manager, Philippe had maintained detailed records of every Delta Trading Company transaction, including coded ledgers documenting their illegal slave purchases, shipping manifests from prohibited Caribbean routes, and most damning of all, correspondence with corrupt officials who had facilitated their operations. More importantly, Philippe had never trusted Jeremiah Aldrich. Something about the Kentucky newcomer's eagerness to engage in the most brutal aspects of their business had struck Philippe as excessive, even by the standards of men trafficking in human flesh. He had begun investigating Aldrich's background months before the murders, discovering inconsistencies in his stated history and financial irregularities suggesting far more complex motivations than simple greed. When news of Marcus's death reached Philippe at the family's struggling plantation, his first reaction wasn't grief, but cold, calculating fury. The official story made no sense to anyone actually knowing the three partners. Marcus, while desperate for money, was fundamentally cautious and would never have confronted Samuel Rochelle violently. Rochelle, despite his rough sailor's background, was a methodical businessman who resolved disputes through negotiation, not knife fights. But most telling of all, Aldrich's account of the evening contained details Philippe knew to be false, including references to money and accounts that had already been moved to different locations weeks earlier. Within days of the funeral, Philippe began his own investigation into the warehouse murders. Using contacts from his brother's business network, he interviewed dock workers, examined shipping records, and even bribed police officers to review the official evidence. What he discovered confirmed his worst suspicions. The crime scene had been carefully staged. The witnesses had been paid to lie. Several crucial evidence pieces had been deliberately overlooked or destroyed. Most importantly, he learned that Aldrich had begun accessing his murdered partner's financial assets within hours of their deaths, suggesting preparation level contradicting his innocent bystander claim. Meanwhile, Henri Rochelle was conducting his own investigation from a very different angle. At 24, Samuel's son possessed his father's maritime connections but combined them with formal legal and business education, making him uniquely qualified to trace the financial aspects of the murders. Henri had spent several years working in New Orleans banks and shipping companies, building relationships with clerks, managers, and officials who could provide information that Philip's more direct approach might miss. Henry's investigation revealed the true scope of Aldrich's theft. By carefully examining bank records, shipping manifests, and property transfers, he documented how the murderer had systematically looted every asset belonging to the Delta Trading Company partnership. Henri calculated that Aldrich had stolen over $60,000 in cash, property, and business investments, wealth representing years of illegal yet profitable operations built on the suffering of hundreds of enslaved human beings. But what made Henri truly dangerous was his understanding of how Louisiana's financial and legal systems actually worked. Unlike Philippe, focused on proving Aldrich's guilt through direct evidence, Henri realized a more effective approach would use Aldrich's own greed against him. Instead of seeking immediate justice through the corrupt court system, Henri began developing a plan to systematically destroy Aldrich's financial foundation, leaving him vulnerable to the same betrayal and violence he had inflicted on others. The two young men met for the first time in fall 1844, more than a year after their relatives' murders. The meeting occurred at a discreet French Quarter restaurant where Philippe had arranged to share his evidence with Henri, hoping to coordinate their individual investigations. What neither man expected was how perfectly their different skills and resources complemented each other, or how completely their shared desire for justice would consume the next decade of their lives. By spring 1845, Philippe Deveau and Henri Rochelle had transformed their individual quests for justice into something far more sophisticated and dangerous, a carefully coordinated conspiracy designed to destroy Jeremiah Aldrich through the same methods he had used to murder their relatives: betrayal, financial manipulation, and ultimately violence disguised as legitimate business. But unlike Aldrich's impulsive brutality, their approach would be methodical, patient, and absolutely devastating in its thoroughness. The first plan phase focused on infiltrating Aldrich's social and business networks. Philippe, using his family's remaining Louisiana society connections, began frequenting the same gentlemen's clubs, political gatherings, and social events where Aldrich was establishing himself as a respectable planter. His goal wasn't confronting his brother's killer directly, but studying the man's habits, weaknesses, and most importantly, his financial vulnerabilities. Philippe was blessed with his late brother's charm and social skills, and within months he had positioned himself as one of Aldrich's casual acquaintances, someone trustworthy enough for sharing drinks, but not significant enough to be considered threatening. Meanwhile, Henri used his banking connections to trace every aspect of Aldrich's financial empire. He discovered the plantation owner's apparent wealth was built on a foundation of risky investments, leveraged loans, and business ventures generating impressive short-term profits while creating long-term liabilities. Most crucially, Henri learned that Aldrich had developed a serious gambling problem, regularly losing thousands in high-stakes poker games and horse racing bets funded through increasingly desperate borrowing against his plantation's future crops. The gambling addiction provided their perfect revenge opening. By 1848, Henri had secured employment with First National Bank of New Orleans, the institution holding the primary mortgage on Willowbrook Plantation. From this position, he subtly manipulated Aldrich's credit arrangements, ensuring loan renewals carried slightly higher interest rates, payment schedules created cash flow problems during critical planting seasons, and the plantation owner was gradually pushed toward the financial desperation, making men vulnerable to manipulation. Simultaneously, Philippe had cultivated relationships with several of New Orleans' most notorious gambling operators, men running high-stakes games where fortunes could be won or lost in a single evening. Through carefully placed bribes and future favor promises, Philippe arranged for Aldrich to be invited to increasingly expensive games where stakes ran higher and the other players secretly worked together, ensuring the plantation owner would lose far more than he could afford. The beauty of their approach lay in its patience and subtlety. Rather than confronting Aldrich directly or seeking quick revenge through violence, they were systematically destroying the financial foundation supporting his social position and self-image. Every due loan created stress. Every gambling loss deepened his desperation. Every failed attempt to raise quick cash through risky investments pushed him closer to the complete ruin, leaving him vulnerable to whatever final punishment they chose to inflict. By 1851, their efforts were beginning showing results. Aldrich's debts had grown to nearly $30,000, and interest payments alone consumed most of his plantation's annual profits. He had been forced to sell several land parcels covering gambling losses, and rumors circulated among Louisiana's planter elite that Willowbrook Plantation faced serious financial trouble. More importantly, Aldrich's personality was beginning showing constant financial pressure strain. He had become short-tempered, suspicious of neighbors' motives, and increasingly desperate in attempts to find new income sources. But Philippe and Henri weren't content with mere financial ruin. Their ultimate goal was subjecting Aldrich to the same humiliation and terror their murdered relatives had experienced in their final moments. They wanted him to understand that his prosperity had been built on blood, his respectability was fiction, and justice had finally found him despite all his careful planning and brutal efficiency. The final revenge phase would require pushing Aldrich beyond mere financial desperation into a position where he would be forced to accept whatever terms they offered, no matter how degrading or dangerous those terms might be. They needed him so completely trapped that death would seem preferable to alternatives. But they also needed him alive long enough to fully appreciate the sophisticated nature of their vengeance. It was Henri who conceived using Aldrich's own enslaved people as instruments of his destruction. Every plantation owner lived in constant slave rebellion fear, and that fear could be exploited by men understanding the psychological dynamics of the master-slave relationship. But rather than inciting an actual uprising, which would be both dangerous and morally problematic, Henri suggested a more subtle approach. They would use Aldrich's marriage to one of his own enslaved people as the ultimate humiliation, a public degradation destroying his social standing while leaving him legally powerless to escape consequences. The selection of Celeste as Aldrich's final humiliation instrument was not random. Philippe and Henri had spent months studying every person living and working at Willowbrook Plantation, seeking someone whose forced marriage to their target would create maximum possible social damage while also providing them reliable means of controlling Aldrich's ultimate fate. Celeste met all their requirements perfectly, but for reasons extending far deeper than physical appearance or social status. At 38 years old, Celeste was indeed a large woman, but her size was the least remarkable thing about her from Philippe and Henri's perspective. What made her invaluable to their plans was her intelligence, her complete loyalty to her own survival, and most importantly, her absolute hatred for Jeremiah Aldrich. Unlike many enslaved people who had learned hiding true feelings behind compliance masks, Celeste had never bothered concealing contempt for the men who owned her. She performed her head cook duties efficiently and without complaint, but anyone observing carefully could see the cold fury burning behind her eyes whenever Aldrich was present. Her hatred had deep roots. Celeste had been purchased by Aldrich in 1847 from a failed Mississippi plantation, where she had been separated from her husband and 3 children sold to different owners in different states. The separation wasn't economically necessary. Aldrich could have afforded purchasing her entire family, but he had chosen buying only Celeste because he needed an experienced cook and saw no profit in acquiring what he dismissively called unnecessary mouths to feed. When Celeste had begged him to at least purchase her youngest child, a 10-year-old daughter, Aldrich had laughed and told her he was running a plantation, not an orphanage for colored children. For 7 years, Celeste had endured the daily humiliation of preparing elaborate meals for the men who had destroyed her family, serving him expensive delicacies while she survived on scraps and kitchen leftovers. She had watched him entertain guests with business success stories, knowing his wealth was built on stolen money and murdered partners. She had cleaned blood from his clothes when he returned from mysterious nighttime trips, and she had seen him burn documents and letters in the kitchen fireplace during his increasingly desperate attempts hiding evidence of his financial troubles. More importantly, Celeste had gradually accumulated detailed knowledge of Aldrich's daily routines, personal habits, health problems, and growing paranoia about potential threats from creditors and business rivals. She knew which foods he preferred, which medicines he took for chronic stomach ailments, and which plantation house rooms he visited most frequently. This knowledge made her a perfect potential ally for anyone seeking to manipulate or harm her owner, but it also made her extremely valuable to Philippe and Henri's specific revenge plans. The approach to Celeste required delicate handling. Neither Philippe nor Henri could risk direct contact with an enslaved person on Aldrich's property, as such contact would be both legally dangerous and likely arousing suspicion. Instead, they used intermediaries, free people of color working in New Orleans markets with legitimate reasons for occasional rural plantation visits. Through these contacts, they gradually established communication with Celeste, initially offering small money amounts in exchange for information about Aldrich's activities and habits. What they discovered exceeded their expectations. Celeste not only possessed detailed knowledge of her owner's vulnerabilities, but she had been conducting her own subtle psychological warfare campaign against him for years. She had been deliberately oversalting his food, aggravating his stomach problems, accidentally breaking his favorite dishes and personal items, and spreading rumors among the other enslaved people about his financial troubles and potential plans, selling them to cover debts. Her actions had been careful and deniable, designed creating stress and paranoia without providing clear, deliberate sabotage evidence. When Philippe and Henri finally revealed their true identities and Aldrich's destruction plans, Celeste's response was immediate and unequivocal. She would do whatever necessary, helping them destroy the men who had murdered their relatives and ruined her own life. The only condition she demanded was that her cooperation be rewarded with freedom and safe passage to Canada, where she hoped eventually locating her surviving children. Philippe and Henri agreed immediately, recognizing they had found not just a tool for their revenge, but a partner whose personal motivations aligned perfectly with their own justice quest. The final plan details took shape over several careful coordination months. Aldrich would be pushed into complete financial ruin through a series of manipulated gambling losses and called loans, leaving him vulnerable to an offer he couldn't refuse: marry Celeste in a legal ceremony or face immediate death at his creditors' hands. The marriage would destroy his social standing and provide Philippe and Henri with legal property access through their control of his wife. Most importantly, it would place Celeste in a position where she could gradually poison Aldrich over several months, causing him to suffer the same slow, agonizing death their murdered relatives had experienced. But the plan required one more crucial element: timing. They needed ensuring Aldrich's financial collapse coincided with a period when he would be isolated from potential allies and unable seeking help from law enforcement or political connections. The opportunity came in early 1854 when Henri learned that Aldrich was planning attending a high-stakes New Orleans gambling tournament, hoping winning enough money saving his plantation from foreclosure. It would be the perfect moment springing their trap, when Aldrich would be desperate enough accepting any survival offering terms, no matter how degrading those terms might prove. The gambling den where Jeremiah Aldrich would meet his fate was located in a converted warehouse near the New Orleans waterfront, a place where the city's most desperate and dangerous men gathered, risking everything on card turns or dice rolls. The February evening in 1854 when Aldrich arrived was particularly humid and oppressive, with fog rolling off the Mississippi River shrouding the streets in gray mist, seeming muffling sound and blurring boundaries between reality and nightmare. Aldrich entered the den carrying a leather satchel containing $8,000, nearly every liquid asset he could scrape together through slave sales, equipment, and personal property from Willowbrook Plantation. It represented his last desperate attempt, winning enough money satisfying his creditors and saving his plantation from foreclosure. What he didn't know was that Philippe Deveau and Henri Rochelle had been carefully orchestrating this moment for months, ensuring every other player at the high-stakes table would work together, stripping him of his remaining wealth. The game was 5-card stud poker played with stakes starting at $500 per hand and escalating quickly as evening progressed. Aldrich initially experienced moderate success, winning enough smaller pots, believing his luck might finally be changing. But as stakes increased and alcohol flowed more freely, he began making increasingly reckless bets, driven by desperation, combination, and false confidence from his early wins. By midnight, Aldrich had lost more than half his stake, but he continued playing with the desperate intensity of a man, understanding this was literally his last chance, saving himself from complete ruin. The other players, following Philip's careful instructions, allowed him winning occasional hands, keeping him at the table, but gradually increased pressure until he was betting amounts representing his entire remaining fortune on single card draws. The final hand began just after 2 o'clock in the morning, when outside fog had grown so thick that gaslight from street lamps barely penetrated the warehouse windows. Aldrich was dealt what appeared a strong hand, a pair of kings showing with full house possibility if the hidden cards fell correctly. Confident this was his moment, recovering losses and perhaps winning enough, solving his financial problems permanently, he pushed his remaining $3,000 into the table center. But the other players had been dealt even stronger hands. And more importantly, they had been coordinating their bets, ensuring the final pot would be large enough, completely bankrupting Aldrich while leaving him with debts far exceeding anything he could possibly repay. When cards were finally revealed, Aldrich's pair of kings lost to a full house held by a man he didn't recognize, a cold-eyed stranger collecting winnings with the methodical efficiency of someone certain of the outcome from the beginning. As the reality of his complete financial destruction began sinking in, Aldrich sat frozen at the empty table, staring at the felt surface where his last hope had just evaporated. The other players had already departed, but the stranger who had won the final hand remained seated across from him, studying Aldrich with the intensity of a scientist examining an interesting specimen. After several oppressive silence minutes, the stranger finally spoke, his voice carrying a slight French accent seeming familiar but which Aldrich couldn't immediately place. "Mr. Aldrich," the man said, "I believe we need discussing your outstanding obligations. You see, the gentlemen who just departed are not merely gamblers. They represent certain business interests that have been very patient with your financial difficulties. But patience, like luck, eventually runs out." It was at this moment that Philippe Deveau stepped from shadows near the warehouse entrance. His face illuminated by flickering gas light in a way making his resemblance to his murdered brother unmistakably clear. Aldrich's blood turned to ice as he recognized features he had seen twisted in pain and shock 11 years earlier when Marcus Deveau had died with a bullet in his chest and betrayal in his eyes. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Jeremiah," Philippe said, moving closer to the table with predatory grace. "Perhaps because you have. My name is Philippe Deveau and I believe you knew my older brother Marcus quite well. In fact, you were the last person seeing him alive, weren't you?" The warehouse suddenly felt impossibly cold despite the humid Louisiana air outside. Aldrich's hands began shaking as the full scope of his situation became clear. This had never been a random gambling tournament or a plantation saving chance. It had been an elaborate trap planned and executed with the kind of methodical precision speaking of years of patient preparation and unlimited hatred. Henri Rochelle emerged from another warehouse corner, completing the accuser triangle surrounding Aldrich at the poker table. "My father Samuel always said you were clever, Mr. Aldrich. Clever enough murdering 2 men and stealing their life's work, but apparently not clever enough realizing dead men sometimes leave behind sons who remember their father's stories and never forget their father's killers." The warehouse fell silent except for distant ship horns echoing across the fog-shrouded river. Aldrich sat paralyzed between his accusers, his mind racing through possible escapes and finding none. He was alone in an isolated building with 2 men who had spent over a decade planning his destruction. And his complete financial ruin meant no one would be looking for him if he simply disappeared into the Mississippi Delta. Philippe moved to the chair directly across from Aldrich, settling himself with deliberate care before speaking again. "We know everything, Jeremiah. We know about the Delta Trading Company and your illegal slave trading operations. We know about the warehouse where you murdered our fathers in cold blood. We know about the forged documents and the bribed witnesses and the systematic theft of everything they had worked to build. Most importantly, we know you've been living on blood money for 11 years, building your respectable plantation lifestyle on the foundation of their corpses." Henri approached from the other side, producing a leather folder filled with documents he spread across the poker table like courtroom evidence. "These are copies of every financial transaction you've made since 1843, Mr. Aldrich. Bank records showing how you looted our fathers' accounts. Property transfers demonstrating how you acquired assets rightfully belonging to their estates. Even correspondence with some of the corrupt officials who helped you cover your tracks. Officials who have since become far more concerned with their own survival than with protecting yours. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniably authentic." Aldrich recognized documents he thought destroyed years ago. Financial records obtainable only through extensive investigation and careful bribes. And most damning of all, sworn statements from people witnessing various aspects of his crimes but remaining silent until now. Philippe and Henri had built a case proving his guilt in any court of law while also implicating dozens of other prominent Louisiana citizens who had unknowingly helped him launder his stolen wealth. "The question now," Philippe continued, "is what we intend doing with this information. We could turn it over to federal authorities who would be very interested in prosecuting not only you but everyone who helped you integrate stolen money into Louisiana's banking system. Or we could arrange for certain New Orleans parties to learn you've been operating under false pretenses for over a decade, living a lie built on the murder of their business associates and friends. I suspect either approach would result in your death, probably preceded by considerable unpleasantness." Aldrich finally found his voice, though it emerged as little more than a whisper. "What do you want?" "Money. I can get money." My plantation is worth. Your plantation is worthless, Henri interrupted. We hold the mortgage, remember. Along with most of your other debts. We've been systematically acquiring your obligations for years, Mr. Aldrich. Every loan you've taken, every gambling debt you've accumulated, every financial arrangement keeping you afloat, it all belongs to us now. You have nothing left bargaining with except your life. And frankly, we're not particularly interested in preserving that either. The warehouse seemed growing colder as their words' implications sank in. Aldrich was not just bankrupt. He was completely at their mercy, dependent on their whims for his continued existence. Everything he had built, every comfort he had enjoyed, every aspect of the respectable life he had constructed had been systematically stripped away by the sons of the man he had murdered. But as terrifying as his situation was, some mind part still refused accepting death was inevitable. There is, however, one alternative, Philippe said, his voice taking on mock consideration tone. One way you might be permitted continuing breathing, at least for a while longer. It would require a certain dignity sacrifice on your part. A public acknowledgement of your true nature and a demonstration of your complete submission to our authority. Henri smiled with the cold satisfaction of a man about revealing years of careful planning culmination. You're going to marry one of your slaves, Jeremiah. Publicly, legally, and permanently. You're going to stand before God and Louisiana society and take your cook, Celeste, as your lawful wedded wife. You're going to live as her husband, sleep in the same bed, and present yourself to your neighbors as a man who chose marrying his own property. The suggestion was so grotesque, so completely beyond acceptable behavior boundaries in antebellum Louisiana society that Aldrich initially couldn't process what he was hearing. Marriage between a white plantation owner and an enslaved person wasn't just socially unacceptable. It was legal suicide, social annihilation, and personal humiliation on a scale making death seem merciful by comparison. You're insane, Aldrich whispered. No one would ever, it's impossible. No preacher would perform such a ceremony. No court would recognize. Actually, we've already made the necessary arrangements, Philippe replied smoothly. There's a minister in Natchitoches Parish quite heavily in debt to certain gambling establishments. He's agreed performing a completely legal ceremony, properly witnessed and documented. As for the courts, Louisiana law is quite clear that marriage contracts once properly executed are binding regardless of circumstances under which they were created. You would be legally married to Celeste with all the rights and obligations that entails. Henri leaned forward across the table, his eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. The beauty of this arrangement, Mr. Aldrich, is that it gives you a choice. You can refuse our generous offer and face immediate consequences for your crimes, consequences involving considerably more physical pain than you might imagine. Or you can accept temporary humiliation in exchange for continued life, however degraded that life might become. The warehouse fell silent again as Aldrich wrestled with the impossible decision. Death would be final, but at least it would preserve some reputation vestige. His neighbors might remember him as a man with gambling problems and business failures, but they wouldn't know the truth about his murders or crimes. Marriage to Celeste, on the other hand, would destroy every aspect of his social identity while leaving him alive enduring years of public humiliation and private torment. How long, he finally asked. If I agree to this arrangement, how long would it last? Philippe and Henri exchanged a look speaking of shared understanding and mutual satisfaction. For the rest of your natural life, Mr. Aldrich. Marriage is a sacred bond, after all. Though, given your age and apparent health problems, we suspect your natural life might not extend quite as long as you might hope. The implication was clear and chilling. They weren't offering him temporary humiliation followed by eventual freedom. They were offering him slow death disguised as marriage, prolonged torture destroying his spirit before finally claiming his body. But the alternative, immediate execution in a fog-shrouded warehouse with his body dumped into the Mississippi River, seemed even worse than whatever they had planned. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in this Louisiana warehouse intensifies. If this story gives you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button supporting our content. And don't forget subscribing, never missing stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Aldrich raised his head and looked directly at his tormentors. "If I agree to this marriage, what guarantee do I have that you won't simply kill me anyway?" "None whatsoever," Henri replied with brutal honesty. "But you do have our word that your death when it comes will be considerably more pleasant than what we had originally planned. Think of the marriage as an opportunity demonstrating good behavior. Compliance will be rewarded with kindness. Resistance will be punished with creativity." Philippe produced a document from his coat pocket and placed it on the table beside the evidence of Aldrich's crimes. "This is a marriage contract properly prepared and ready for your signature. The ceremony is scheduled for tomorrow evening at Willowbrook Plantation, where all your neighbors and business associates will be invited, witnessing your voluntary union with Celeste. They've been told you've experienced a religious conversion and wish demonstrating commitment to Christian charity by elevating one of your slaves to wife status. The final humiliation was the requirement presenting the marriage as his own choice, a voluntary Christian benevolence act rather than the forced degradation it actually represented. His neighbors would think him eccentric, possibly insane, but they would also believe he had chosen this path of his own free will. No one would suspect coercion by vengeful murdered partners' sons because no one else knew Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle had ever existed." Aldrich reached for the marriage contract with hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the document steady. The terms were simple and absolute. He would marry Celeste in a legal ceremony, live with her as husband and wife, and provide for her welfare as he would any spouse. In exchange, his creditors would refrain from immediate debt collection and would allow him continuing Willowbrook Plantation operation under their oversight. As he signed his name to the contract destroying his life, Aldrich tried convincing himself he might find some escape from this trap once he had bought time through compliance. Perhaps he could appeal to authorities, flee to another state, or find some legal loophole invalidating the marriage. But even as these desperate thoughts flickered through his mind, he could see satisfaction in Philippe and Henri's eyes. They had planned this moment for over a decade, and they had anticipated every possible escape avenue he might consider. "Welcome to the family, brother-in-law," Philippe said as he collected the signed contract. "We'll see you tomorrow evening for the ceremony. I trust you'll dress appropriately for such a momentous occasion." The morning of March 15, 1854 dawned gray and oppressive, with heavy clouds threatening rain and a humid wind carrying rotting vegetation stench from nearby swamps. Aldrich had not slept since returning from New Orleans, spending the night pacing his study and staring at the marriage contract representing the end of everything he had worked building over 15 Louisiana years. Celeste had been informed of the arrangement through intermediaries, though she pretended surprise when Aldrich awkwardly attempted explaining the situation during breakfast. She listened to his stammering account of financial difficulties and social obligations with the kind of patient attention a parent might show a child confessing minor misbehavior. When he finished his pathetic explanation, she simply nodded and said, "Yes, Master Aldrich, I understand. I'll prepare myself for the ceremony." The calm acceptance in her voice terrified him more than anger or resistance would have. It suggested preparation and coordination level, implying she had known about the plan long before he had been forced agreeing to it. As he watched her move efficiently around the kitchen, preparing their last meal as master and slave, Aldrich began realizing his tormentors had been far more thorough in their planning than he had initially understood. Throughout the day, neighbors and acquaintances arrived at Willowbrook Plantation, drawn by invitations Philippe and Henri had sent in Aldrich's name. The guests were told they were witnessing a remarkable Christian charity demonstration, as their neighbor had decided honoring one of his most faithful servants by offering her marriage protection and dignity. Most arrived expecting seeing some elaborate joke, or perhaps evidence Aldrich had finally succumbed to mental instability his recent financial troubles seemed suggesting. What they found instead was a properly organized wedding ceremony, complete with decorations, refreshments, and a nervous groom genuinely committed to the bizarre proceedings. Aldrich had dressed in his finest clothes as Philippe had suggested, and he played his role with the desperate conviction of a man understanding his survival depended on convincing performance. When guests asked about his unusual decision, he repeated the explanation about religious conversion and Christian duty with enough apparent sincerity that most accepted it as the eccentric choice of a man under considerable stress. Celeste appeared for the ceremony dressed in a simple but elegant gown someone had provided for the occasion. At 38 she was indeed a large woman, but she carried herself with dignity and composure, impressing even the skeptical guests. More importantly, she seemed genuinely pleased by the attention and respect she was receiving, smiling graciously at the assembled crowd and thanking them for witnessing what she called the most important day of my life. The minister from Natchitoches Parish performed the ceremony with professional efficiency, reading traditional vows and asking for appropriate responses from both bride and groom. When he reached the part about speaking now or forever holding your peace, several guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one was brave enough challenging what appeared a legal and voluntary union between consenting adults. Aldrich's voice barely carried beyond the first witness row when he spoke his vows, but Celeste's responses were clear and confident. She promised loving, honoring, and obeying her new husband with the kind of conviction making the ceremony seem almost normal, as if marriages between plantation owners and their former slaves were commonplace Louisiana society events. The most disturbing moment came when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and instructed Aldrich kissing his bride. The plantation owner's face went pale as he leaned forward fulfilling this final requirement, and for a moment it seemed as though he might collapse entirely. But Celeste steadied him with surprising gentleness, rising on her toes, meeting his lips in a brief chaste kiss, sealing their legal union and beginning his final destruction phase. As the guests departed, most shaking heads in bewilderment at what they had witnessed, Aldrich found himself alone with his new wife in the plantation house that had once represented his successful Louisiana society integration. The building suddenly felt foreign and threatening, as if the marriage ceremony had transformed familiar rooms into alien spaces where he no longer belonged. Celeste moved through the house with the confidence of someone understanding the power dynamic had shifted permanently. She began rearranging furniture and personal belongings with casual authority, making changes emphasizing her new status as household mistress. When Aldrich attempted protesting one of her decisions, she fixed him with a stare containing years of accumulated hatred and quietly said, "We're married now, Jeremiah. Husband and wife. Partners. I think it's time we started acting like it, don't you?" That first night, as they lay in the same bed that had once been his private sanctuary, Aldrich understood his tormentors had devised a punishment far more sophisticated than simple death. They had trapped him in a daily powerlessness reminder, surrounded him with constant presence of someone knowing exactly what he had done and exactly what he deserved. Every meal she cooked, every word she spoke, every apparent affection gesture would be a calculated reminder that his comfortable life had been built on blood and theft. But the true horror was yet to come. As Aldrich would soon discover, the marriage was not the culmination of Philippe and Henry's revenge. It was merely the beginning of a slow, methodical destruction, making his final moments in that warehouse seem merciful by comparison. The first marriage month passed with deceptive normalcy as Celeste settled into her new role with efficiency, impressing even Aldrich's remaining neighbors. She managed household staff with firm authority, entertained the few visitors still feeling comfortable calling at Willowbrook Plantation, and maintained social pretenses, allowing her husband preserving some former respectability vestige. To outside observers, the unlikely marriage appeared functioning as well as any conventional rural Louisiana union. But Aldrich was beginning noticing subtle daily routine changes, filling him with growing unease. His breakfast coffee had developed a slightly bitter aftertaste he couldn't identify despite being prepared with the same beans and methods Celeste had used for years. His evening meals, while expertly prepared and beautifully presented, left him feeling vaguely nauseated and unusually tired. Most disturbing of all, he had begun experiencing headaches and dizziness episodes that seemed worsening whenever he spent extended time in his wife's company. Initially, he attributed these symptoms to stress and the emotional toll of his degraded circumstances. The forced marriage humiliation combined with his awareness of complete dependence on Philippe and Henry's continued mercy was certainly enough causing physical problems. But as weeks passed and his condition gradually worsened, Aldrich began suspecting his symptoms might have a more deliberate cause. His suspicions were confirmed during a conversation with Dr. Hamilton Warren, Willowbrook's longtime physician, who had come examining Aldrich after he collapsed during a business meeting with potential cotton buyers. Dr. Warren's preliminary examination revealed symptoms consistent with chronic poisoning, specifically the gradual accumulation of toxic substances slowly destroying his digestive system and nervous functions. "Your condition is quite serious, Mr. Aldrich," Dr. Warren explained as he packed his medical instruments. "The symptoms suggest prolonged arsenic or similar metallic poison exposure. Such poisoning typically occurs over several months, with the victim experiencing increasing weakness, digestive problems, and neurological deterioration. Without immediate treatment and removal from contamination source, the condition is invariably fatal. The diagnosis confirmed Aldrich's worst fears about his wife's true intentions. Celeste was systematically murdering him with the same patient methodology Philippe and Henri had used, destroying his finances and social standing. She was administering poison in carefully measured doses, probably mixed into his food or drink, creating a slow death appearing natural to anyone not specifically looking for deliberate harm signs. But confronting Celeste directly would be both dangerous and pointless. She was protected by her legal status as his wife, her apparent innocence of any wrongdoing, and most importantly, her connections to the two men controlling every aspect of his continued existence. If he accused her of poisoning him, she could simply deny the charges while Philippe and Henri arranged more immediate and violent consequences for his paranoid accusations against their chosen justice instrument. Instead, Aldrich began taking elaborate precautions protecting himself from further poisoning. He started preparing his own meals in secret using ingredients he personally selected and cooking utensils kept hidden in his study. He avoided drinking anything Celeste had prepared, relying instead on water from a well only he could access. Most importantly, he began sleeping in a locked guest room rather than sharing the marital bed where his wife might have poisoning opportunities while he was unconscious. These defensive measures provided temporary symptom relief, but they also created new problems threatening exposing his growing paranoia to outside observers. Neighbors visiting Willowbrook Plantation began commenting on his gaunt appearance, his nervous behavior, and his obvious reluctance eating or drinking anything in his wife's presence. Word spread throughout the parish that Jeremiah Aldrich was displaying mental instability signs, possibly resulting from the stress associated with his unusual marriage. Celeste played her role in this psychological campaign with masterful skill. When guests expressed concern about her husband's behavior, she responded with the kind of patient worry a devoted wife might show for a beloved spouse suffering illness or mental disturbance. She prepared elaborate meals he refused eating, offered drinks he declined with obvious suspicion, and generally behaved like a woman whose husband care efforts were being rejected by a man losing touch with reality. The brilliance of her approach was making Aldrich's defensive actions appear paranoid delusion symptoms rather than genuine threat responses. His refusal eating her cooking looked like irrational fear rather than intelligent caution. His secretive behavior and obvious wife mistrust seemed like mental breakdown evidence rather than proof he was being systematically murdered. Most devastatingly, his attempts explaining the situation to Dr. Warren and other trusted associates were dismissed as ravings of a man driven insane by financial stress and social humiliation. No one could believe a recently enslaved woman would be capable of conceiving and executing such a sophisticated murder plot, or that she would have the knowledge and resources necessary obtaining and administering exotic poisons over an extended period. By late spring 1854, Aldrich found himself trapped in a nightmare scenario where his accurate understanding of his wife's murderous intentions had been transformed into evidence of his own mental instability. He was being slowly killed by a woman he was legally bound living with, while his every self-protection or help-seeking attempt was interpreted as proof he was losing his mind. But the psychological torture was far from over. Philippe and Henri had designed their revenge to include not just physical suffering, but complete social isolation and gradual destruction of every relationship Aldrich had maintained during his apparent respectability years. They wanted him dying alone, friendless, and utterly convinced justice had finally caught him despite all his careful planning and brutal efficiency. The truth about his situation was revealed to Aldrich in the most cruel and methodical way possible during a dinner party Celeste had organized celebrating their 3-month wedding anniversary. She had invited several remaining neighbors along with Dr. Warren and other prominent local society members, maintaining cordial relationships with the plantation despite the unusual marriage circumstances. Aldrich had spent the day preparing for the evening with his customary paranoia, secretly eating beforehand and planning avoiding anything his wife had prepared. But when guests arrived, Celeste announced she had prepared a special surprise for the occasion, a wine bottle supposedly aging in the plantation cellar since before their marriage, which she wanted opening as a symbolic toast to their future together. The wine was presented with great ceremony, opened before all guests demonstrating it hadn't been tampered with, and poured into glasses cleaned and prepared in full view of everyone present. When Celeste proposed a toast to their marriage and hopes for many more years together, Aldrich found himself unable refusing without appearing completely insane to his assembled neighbors. As he raised the glass to his lips, Aldrich caught sight of his wife's eyes across the dinner table. For just a moment, her devoted affection mask slipped, and he saw cold satisfaction of someone about achieving a long-anticipated victory. But by then it was too late avoiding drinking the wine, and he could only hope whatever poison she had used would work quickly enough, sparing him prolonged suffering. The effects began within wine consumption minutes. Aldrich experienced severe stomach cramps, followed by breathing difficulty and burning sensation in his throat and chest. As he collapsed at the dinner table, gasping for air and clutching his stomach, the assembled guests assumed they were witnessing final breakdown of a man slowly losing his mind for months. Dr. Warren immediately began examining Aldrich, but his efforts were hampered by what appeared hysterical Celeste interference. She threw herself across her husband's body, sobbing and begging the doctor saving him, while simultaneously making effective medical treatment impossible for Warren. Her performance was so convincing that other guests spent their time comforting her rather than helping with the medical emergency. But as Aldrich lay dying on his own dining room floor, Celeste leaned close to his ear and whispered words revealing the true scope of the conspiracy destroying his life. Marcus Devo was my cousin, Jeremiah. Samuel Rochelle was my uncle by marriage. I've been working with Philippe and Henri since 1845, waiting for the perfect opportunity, watching you die the way you made them die, slowly, painfully, and completely alone. The revelation that his wife was not merely his enemy's tool, but an active family conspiracy participant added a final horror layer to Aldrich's death. He had been living for months with a woman whose hatred was personal and immediate, not just hired or coerced. Every meal she had cooked, every conversation they had shared, every moment of apparent domestic tranquility had been part of an elaborate performance maximizing his suffering while minimizing suspicion about his decline's true cause. As his vision darkened and breathing became increasingly labored, Aldrich could hear Celeste continuing her performance for guests' benefit. She was begging Dr. Warren, trying harder, pleading with God, sparing her beloved husband, and generally behaving like a woman whose world was collapsing around the loss of the men she loved. The other guests offered comfort and support, completely convinced they were witnessing tragic accident rather than culmination of an 11-year revenge quest. Jeremiah Aldrich died at 9:47 p.m. on June 18, 1854, surrounded by neighbors believing he had suffered a stroke or heart attack brought on by months of mental instability and declining health. Dr. Warren's official cause of death was listed as natural causes associated with prolonged nervous exhaustion, a diagnosis satisfying everyone except Philippe Devo and Henri Rochelle, who knew exactly what had killed him and why. The funeral was well attended, with Celeste playing grieving widow with such conviction that several prominent ladies from neighboring plantations offered helping her manage Willowbrook Plantation during her mourning period. No one suspected the tearful woman at graveside was actually celebrating successful completion of the most elaborate murder plot in Louisiana history. But the story didn't end with Aldrich's death. Philippe and Henri had planned for every contingency, including property disposition and his widow's fate. As Aldrich's legal heir, Celeste inherited Willowbrook Plantation along with all its debts and obligations. Debts that, as they quickly reminded her, were now owed to them as representatives of various financial institutions. Within a month of the funeral, Celeste had signed documents transferring plantation ownership to Philippe and Henri in exchange for outstanding debt forgiveness. She then disappeared from Louisiana entirely, presumably heading north with enough money, starting a new free life in a place where no one knew her history as either slave or murderess. The official Jeremiah Aldrich death records and subsequent Willowbrook Plantation transfer raised no Louisiana authorities' suspicion as they dealt with far more pressing concerns while the nation moved inexorably toward civil war. The story of the plantation owner who had married his slave and then died of natural causes became a minor local history footnote, occasionally mentioned as example of eccentric behavior financial stress could produce in otherwise respectable men. But among certain New Orleans families and surrounding parishes, a different story version circulated quietly for generations. This version spoke of conspiracy so elaborate and patient that it had taken 11 years reaching completion, of justice so perfectly calibrated that punishment matched crime in both duration and suffering. Most importantly, it served as warning about business partner betrayal dangers, especially when those partners had relatives intelligent enough and ruthless enough, spending a decade planning perfect revenge. Philippe Devo and Henri Rochelle had achieved something remarkable in antebellum Southern society context. They had successfully prosecuted a murder case no court would have touched, executed a death sentence no judge would have imposed, and done it all through methods leaving no evidence of their involvement. Their success had required patience, intelligence, financial resources, and most importantly, complete understanding of how Louisiana's social and legal systems actually functioned. The Willowbrook Plantation transformation after Aldrich's death provided final evidence of how thoroughly Philippe and Henri had planned their revenge. Rather than selling the property for profit, they converted it into a refuge for freed slaves and escaped bondpeople, creating exactly the kind of humanitarian institution that would have horrified the men who had built his fortune on human trafficking. The plantation house that had once entertained Louisiana's elite became an underground railroad station, helping enslaved people reach freedom in northern states and Canada. This transformation was not just symbolically appropriate, but also practically invisible to local authorities. Philippe and Henry's legitimate business connections provided cover for Willowbrook's unusual activities, while their respectable Louisiana businessman reputation deflected suspicion from anyone questioning the plantation's new purpose. They had used their enemy's own property, continuing the fight against the institution, making him wealthy, turning his legacy into a weapon against everything he had represented. But perhaps the most remarkable revenge aspect was how completely it had erased Jeremiah Aldrich from history. Unlike more conventional murder victims who at least receive recognition as crime casualties, Aldrich had been systematically eliminated from existence. His wealth had been redistributed to his victims' families. His property had been converted to purposes directly contradicting his values. His reputation had been destroyed through his own actions rather than through posthumous crime revelation. Most importantly, his death manner had been designed ensuring no one would remember him as anything more than a failed plantation owner making poor financial decisions and marrying unwisely. There would be no monuments to his memory, no family line preserving his name, and no historical record of his actual accomplishments or crimes. He had been deleted from Louisiana history as thoroughly as if he had never existed at all. This mystery shows us that justice sometimes operates outside legal institution boundaries, particularly in societies where those institutions are designed protecting the powerful at vulnerable expense. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.